I guess, to be back here again. I was just here Saturday, and then I was here the week before that. I'm not complaining. It's nice to be back here. So in my 15 minutes, I'm going to try to say a lot of things that will catalyze a good conversation around the tables, and then after you've talked for a while, you can ask me a few questions, and I'm happy to do my best to answer those questions. So one thing just occurred to me that I want to say at the very beginning, and that's particularly because if you're talking about community and economic development, I think one of the things that sometimes happens when people become aware of the fact that they need to care about public concerns, of which community and economic development are part of it, sometimes when they need to pay attention to the particulars of those things, and when they discover that in an evangelical environment, there isn't exactly always enthusiasm about those things. Okay, that's putting it mildly, perhaps at times. So what happens is people begin to feel like that what they need to do, if they're going to care about that, is that they need to migrate from evangelical commitments in order to care about public concerns. Okay, and part of what I want to say is, I don't think so. Yes, there are a lot of people who either were evangelical or who aren't, who talk about those things, but it is not the exclusive domain of non-evangelical theological and biblical commitments to care about public concerns. So I'm glad that this series is happening so that you can be doing some of the thinking and working about how you're doing this from an evangelical environment. Because I think sometimes people feel like they have to choose. Can I be this biblically committed evangelical person, or do I have to be a person who is caring about these other public matters? Because it seems like the only people who talk about those things are others of some kind. Now, this also happens to be the case, by the way, if sometimes a person talks about race. I spoke at a church in California in November, and the pastor that invited me told me that at their church, there were a lot of Republicans at this church, that many people thought if you talk about race, you're automatically talking about a liberal issue. And please understand that it's not a liberal or conservative issue. And I'll just use this as an example. And Bruce, I'm sure you know this. When James Cone writes about black theology, he's saying a plague on your house to white liberals at Garrett. Okay? That's who he's thinking about. So you need to understand that the race problem and all these other problems are problems that actually span the whole liberal conservative spectrum. All right? So that's just a few words about saying to address these things does not require a biblical or theological migration of the sort that sometimes people think they have to make. Okay? So that's very important to say that. But part of the reason perhaps why they think they have to has to do with a problem that I think is created as to why people can't connect these things. And that's because of the bifurcation, the separation of theology and ethics, which is actually a modern problem. It's a liberal problem and it is a conservative problem. And I will note two ways that this works out and maybe say something about a third. First, when I was a student getting my MDiv at Trinity, it was interesting to me that I'm very appreciative of my education, okay? So you're in a good place. But it always seemed interesting to me to be thinking about, we're learning all of this Bible and theology, and we're not, as we're learning about it, talking about why it matters. We're getting what the meaning is right, perhaps. We're getting perhaps how to synthesize this theologically right, but the so what was often left wanting, except for the fact that there was an ethics course tacked on to the curriculum. Okay, so that ethics is it's like an add-on. as if it had nothing to do with what the Bible teaches and what systematic theology is about. And to me, that always just seemed just a little bit strange, especially for people that take the Bible seriously. If you're taking the Bible seriously, so you only take it seriously so you're good at thinking about it. Is that it? Or does it have something to do with how we go about our lives? So there's that piece of it. Now, a sort of practical way that I had to contend with this was I was over in the library, and I was looking through ethics texts, and what I discovered then, and this is like 1992, that out of all of the ethics texts that were in the library at that time, 2 of them included race as an ethical issue. Okay? It's not a whole lot better now. I had a student look up for me all the ethics texts, liberal or conservative, written in the last 30 years. And out of about 90 books, maybe 14 said something about race, gave it partial coverage. And at least one of those was a second edition of one of the other ones. So the point is that it just seems strange to me that Christian ethics text would have nothing to say about that. And I think it's an example of a problem with the way that ethics works out, not just for evangelicals, but certainly with them. And here's the problem. The problem is that when we think about how our faith touches the rest of our lives, it's really kind of an ad hoc kind of thing. In other words, whatever shows up on my doorstep, that raises the question. And so I only ask questions about how to live when something presents itself to me, rather than asking the question, how is it that what I believe, the entirety of my faith, how does that lead to me having a disposition where I'm asking about how ought I to live in my entire life out of this faith? And how do I have my antenna up so that there are things that I am looking for or wondering about, that even if it's not my problem, it might be somebody else's problem. And even if it's somebody else's problem, it's still a problem that Christians need to contend with. So that has to do with politics, that has to do with culture, that has to do with economics, that has to do with business, that has to do with education, has to do with medicine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because they are all facets of just what life is and how we go about our lives. So what I want to encourage you to do when you think about your faith, you think about the relationship between theology and ethics, think about the fact that your faith ought to be orienting you towards at least a frame of mind and a kind of radar that you're kind of searching all the time, so that you're aware of the fact that, oh, there are these problems out here, and even if they're not my problems, they're still things that merit attention. Because I think otherwise, the way that Christians will do ethics is, it matters if it shows up at my door, which means it only matters to me as an individual person. Right? Or if it matters to us, it's because I'm connected to somebody. So still, me, the individual person, is the determinant of whether something is an ethical issue or not, whether it matters to me. When really the question is, does it matter to God, and does it matter to what God wants in his world? I mean, that needs to be the orientation and the disposition that we have about what matters. And if that's the case, then certainly things like race matter, and certainly things like community and economic development matter. So in my remaining 9 minutes, I'm going to say several other things. So one of the things that you will have to do, and maybe you do already or feel like you're doing, is you need to help people understand why they should even care about community or economic development. In other words, why does this matter to Christians? In other words, why is it something that emerges out of what Christians believe? To which my response is, why does it matter? Because it always has mattered. That's why. And it's always mattered because, showing my sort of Kuyperian, or waving my Kuyperian flag here, right on page 1 of the Bible, when God creates humans and he gives them what some of us call the cultural mandate, he is giving humans the great responsibility and opportunity to be those that are the stewards of the created order. That stewardship includes various ways that we work with, manage the created order. And I guess the point to say about this is that, that's really a gigantic task. Such a gigantic task that I and some others call it the first Great Commission. Or sometimes I like to call it the forgotten Great Commission. Because in a lot of churches, people don't even talk about it. So that initial commission is giving human beings the responsibility and opportunity to be those who are working with God's world to lead to its flourishing. Now, there are various ways that we do that, and it's various ways that we're managing our lives together. And when you do that, it is inescapably involving economic life, inescapably involving political life, inescapably involving cultural life. That's just part of it. Now, it's possible that some people might like to say, well, yes, I guess we should care about those things, but what about Genesis 3? Because the fall happens, and isn't the gospel about sort of rescuing us from the fall? And doesn't the fall make things just kind of an exercise of futility? To which I like to say, so here's a nice catchphrase for you: the fall doesn't mean fruitlessness. Okay, the fall does not mean fruitlessness. And actually, if you read the curse, it's pretty obvious. Because in the curse, he doesn't say, okay, you die. What he says is, you will still bear children, but boys are going to hurt now. But you're still going to bear children. And he says, you're going to still get fruitfulness from the ground. It just got a lot more complicated to get fruitfulness from the ground. But you're still getting fruitfulness from the ground. So the point is, the fall doesn't mean, okay, run around like you're crazy and say, Lord, please send a Savior, and good, and then take me out of here. The point is that what God said at the beginning about engaging his world and stewarding his world, managing life in his world, it remains, it's just a lot more complicated. Okay? So the point is that it's always mattered to do the things that are involved with community life, economic life, etc. It's always there. Somebody else might say, well, it really seems kind of worldly to me, to which I say, read 1 John 2:15 and 17, and when you see it says don't love the world, and it describes what the world is, it talks about three things that are of the world: lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, the pride of life. Last time I checked, none of those are about the created order. They're about dispositions that people have that are distorted ways of living in God's world. To be worldly is to live in God's world in that distortion field. That's what worldliness is. And that distortion field orients people to live in God's world with disregard for the God who made the world. So it's living in God's world as if God has nothing to do with the world. But actually caring about things like community life, economic life, that's not the problem. The way you go about it might be the problem, but doing it's not the problem. So it's not a problem of worldliness. It's also not antithetical to a commitment to redemption. Sometimes the way that people think about redemption, creation and redemption are at odds. So what did Jesus come to do? Oh, Jesus, my great rescuer, take us away, please, from this world that's going to hell in a handbasket, when, in fact, the fact of the matter is this. So last time I checked, when, Christmas comes around or Easter comes around, so, okay, we say that Jesus is born, and we really believe he's an actual baby, like with weight, he cried, you could cuddle him, etc. And also Easter, we're getting there, we claim, I believe, right, we confess that he's resurrected in a body. Right now, if he's resurrected in a body, and he wasn't, making a little joke with the disciples about that when Thomas came, they all knew he was a hologram. So watch what happens, because I'm really a hologram. I don't have a body, right? Watch, no, none of that. So if they know that he's in a body, here's the point: humans are the crown of creation. Okay, being embodied is God's idea. Jesus takes on a body. When he takes on a body, I like to say he echoes what God says in Genesis 1:31 when he looks at his creation and says, it's very good. Okay? So Jesus coming on with a body is one of the ways that we see for certain that what God is doing in salvation is not saying, okay, well, creation's lost to me, so I'm going to save as many people as I can before I blow it up like the Death Star. So I'll send Jesus for that. No. Jesus takes on materiality because God is reclaiming his world. So redemption is about God's reclaiming of his world, not about creating an antipathy that we have with God's created order. It is rather actually reorienting us so that we live like humans ought to live more and more in that created order. And if we're living more and more like we ought to live in that created order, I think that ought to have something to do with community life and economic development. It ought to, right? So when we talk about a word like gospel, is this a gospel issue? Somebody might ask. I'm glad they asked. Because last time I checked, when Jesus announces the gospel, it's a gospel of a kingdom, not a gospel simply of an individual transaction. So please understand, I just taught on justification and atonement Monday night. It's really important. But isn't it interesting to think about this? After people become Christians, do they just sort of sit around and do nothing? Right? I mean, is that okay? I'm saved. I'm waiting for Jesus to come back, and that's it. And maybe I'll tell somebody about him so they can sit around too. Is that the point? Right? I mean, what is discipleship about? It is not about becoming as disconnected as possible from the world that God has made. It is about that reorientation into life as it ought to be in the world that God has made. Without, because I'm not a postmillennialist, and I'm not a triumphalist in terms of how things work out. So it's orienting us to participating in God's world, doing things that have a kind of, at best, they are penultimate, whatever we succeed, whatever our successes are. Okay, so the point isn't about making the kingdom arrive, but it is about living, at the very least, like people who are providing glimpses of kingdom reality in every dimension of life, so that people have an idea of what's coming. Now, the good thing about not being a postmillennialist here is that means that you can try and fail. It means you can refine things. You can revise things. You can throw it at a wall and see if it sticks. Okay, I'll try something else. You keep trying to do things. You use your imagination. And you keep at it, rather than saying, Jesus saved me so that I can escape. If that's the salvation it is, no wonder some people think that Christians are genuinely heavenly minded and no earthly good. But to be heavenly minded ought to be really making us the most earthly good possible. The people who ought to be on the leading edge of taking life seriously, particularly where all the great pain and distress of the world is, it ought to be the people of God. And it is not in competition with getting people personally reconciled to God. It's showing what personally reconciled people of God ought to be doing when they're living like humans in the world that God has made until he comes back and sets everything right.